And that brings us to the last 10 minutes of our program in Live on Live. Today, we're looking at Cuba. Cuba's president is in Paris today on his first official state visit to France, his first ever visit to Europe, actually. France seems to be the point of entry for Cuba, which is rebuilding its ties with the West after it restored relations with the United States last year, after more than a half century of broken ties. To talk more about France's role in all of this, rebuilding Europe's ties, I'm joined by Stéphane Witkowski, the head of the Institute for Higher Studies on Latin America here in Paris, also a member of the Cuba Cooperation France. Welcome to RFI.
Good evening.
So this is a historic state and political visit for Raul Castro. There's a lot of business talk, too, a lot of money. And I'd like to start with debt. France recently helped negotiate to write off, I think, nearly 8 billion euros of debt that Cuba owed to about 19 different countries, called the Paris Club. The benefit to Cuba seems clear. What's the benefit to a country like France that's losing out on a lot of money here?
I think it's a very important visit because it's an historical and political visit, because there are aspects, political aspects, diplomatic aspects, but also economic and aspects, but it's not the most important, I will say.
The money isn't the most important.
It is important because of the Club of Paris, as you know. It's very important, and I think it's the principal visit of this visit. I think there are other aspects.
So you think the political and the cultural links are maybe more important?
COP21 also was very important because, as you know, there were a sort of alliance between Cuba and France to have a good result, positive result.
Cuba played a lot behind the roles, behind the scenes.
As you know, do you remember that during the François Hollande's visit in Cuba in May, he had a contact with Fidel Castro, and they spoke about COP21, things about ecological aspects, and I think at that time, France was very conscious that of the role of Cuba, not only in the region, Caribbean, but also with other countries of Latin America.
What is that role? I mean, talk about that role in particular.
For example, in the case of Colombia, we know that Cuba is very important to the negotiations with FARC, with the government, Colombian government.
The guerrilla rebels in Colombia.
Yes, and as you know also, in 2014, in January, there were a summit of the Community of Latin American Countries with 34 presidents of states, with Ban Ki-moon and Secretary General of OEA also present in La Habana. And it was the perception of the influences of Cuba in Latin America, and probably the decisions taken by Barack Obama didn't want to be out of that evolution.
So Cuba is sort of playing a big role in Latin America. France maybe recognizing this, but also Cuba recognizing France's role, say, in Europe. I mean, is that why the choice of country to come here first?
It's very important regarding the positions of European Union regarding Cuba. As you know, since 2003, with the influence of the president of the government, Spanish, Aznar, decided to take a position, a common position related with Cuba, and this didn't help different governments to go forward.
Can we talk about this common position? We're talking here in terms of declarations of the EU vis-a-vis, say, things like human rights and that kind of thing in Cuba?
Yes, I think it's one of aspects. Well, there are three aspects of that negotiations: the political aspects, cooperations, and economic aspects. Regarding human rights, I think it's very tied with the political and diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. And I think there probably different kind of evolutions will occur in Cuba In 2018, because it will be the last year of last term of Raul Castro's government.
Talk about the difference in approach then. You're saying human rights, the Americans seem to have a different approach, say, than, are you saying that the Europeans do in terms of what they'd like to pressure or ask for?
I think it's not different conceptions of visions regarding human rights. I think that the internal political in Cuba regarding human rights and political situation in Cuba is directly linked with the evolution with the United States. You cannot say that it's completely linked, because the question of national sovereignty in Cuba is very important. I think it was questions before Cuban's revolutions in '59, and probably it will be also a question after the end of this period with Cubans and Raul Castro's government.
So sovereignty is an important concept, and of course then you get into issues like people who criticize or that kind of thing, who get put in jail or get harassed, and that's, I mean, is that what we're talking about, the tension of the outside view?
The question is, I think that Fidel Castro also said that it's important for Cuba to be an independent country, and the problems of human rights are directly linked with the persons who have ties, particular lies with the Cuban communities in Florida, and giving money also, and so
how does that relate then to Europe in terms of, I mean, because there's pressure on François Hollande, the French president, to bring up some of these issues. What are, journalistic freedom, press freedom, that kind of thing? Does France have that kind of power to say anything, to make things change in Cuba, or all that really depends on internal Cuban politics?
I think there are two visions from human rights. The French positions is very linked with the political rights, civil rights in democracy, classical, like in Europe for other countries. In the case of Cuba, they have another visions of human rights, including economic, social rights also, for minorities also. They are...
sort of social cohesion maybe over individual rights.
Cohesion only for minorities, for sexual minorities. As you know, the daughter, Raul Castro, Mariela Castro, is working as director of Senesex from sexual education in Cuba, and she is quite powerful in Cuba to change this kind of positions regarding the human rights in that sense.
So there's sort of slightly different visions, but I want to go back to what you were saying, this idea of sovereignty being really important for Cuba, and it is sort of this founding idea. And as we see Cuba opening up to more of a world market, a free market, companies coming in, lots of business deals, is there a fear that sovereignty might kind of get overshadowed by, say, business interests who come in and say, I want to develop here? And that seems to me like the crux of all of this is, as Cuba opens up, that's the main tension.
I think you're pointing the main challenge, what kind of type of evolution, economic and social and political evolution, the three are completely linked. So it's very complicated for the Cuban government to imagine a kind of evolution during the next years. But the principal point is to consider the independence, national independence of Cuba, and what they call the social aspects of for the Cuban populations, for health, for education,
keeping all those benefits that people have.
All that benefits.
But when we see this meeting here in France, for example, and France being the first European country, and lots of ties there, does France have this sort of same vision, or is there a lot of France wants to, for example, have its companies come in and work on roads and work on railroads, do infrastructure, that kind of thing. Do you think France and Cuba share the same vision of Cuba's development, or you've been an observer of both? I
think they have more or less the same vision. For example, during this visit, you will have a declaration regarding questions of equitable commerce, commerce équitable, and other regarding
like fair trade issues.
Fair trade issues, exactly. So all the considerations about the social economy is
things that aren't necessarily, say, on the tip of the fingers or the tip of the lips of American entrepreneurs who are hoping to enter in when there's an embargo lifted. Those are things that maybe France is approaching differently.
Question of embargo will be very more long, to take a long time, because as the Congress is Republican, as you know, so the evolution will be it will be not in
It'll take a while.
Before the presidential election, as I suppose. Yeah.
Well, lots to talk about here on Cuba, but I'm going to have to leave it at that. Thank you to Stéphane Witkowski of the Institute for Higher Studies on Latin America. That brings us to the end of Paris Live PM here on Radio France International. From me, Sarah Elzas. Goodbye.